A security officer stomped on a Marine's gear in anger. Seconds later, his face met the conveyor belt, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He pressed his boot down on a baby's tiny hand, crushing it against the airport floor as screams filled the terminal. Subscribe if you believe no uniform should protect cruelty. Keep moving. The barked command sliced through the morning din of Northvale International like a drill sergeant's shout in boot camp. It didn't match the usual airport chaos, scanners humming, trays rattling, and passengers muttering complaints about liquids and belts. This voice was sharp, aggressive. It cut straight toward Caleb Cole as he hesitated at the security checkpoint, fumbling with the baby carrier in his arms while his infant son, Noah, wailed in distress. Caleb looked up, startled. His hands were shaking slightly, not out of guilt, but out of the familiar panic any new father felt when their child cried in public. The infant squirmed against his chest, his tiny face scrunched red from the noise and discomfort. Caleb gave a nervous, apologetic smile, bouncing slightly on his heels, whispering, "It's okay, buddy, almost done," as he tried to soothe the baby. Behind him, Ethan Cole stepped forward calmly, placing their bags into the plastic trays with the smooth efficiency of a man used to order. Former Marine, combat-tested, disciplined. He kept his expression neutral, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, caught the movement immediately. Security Officer Darren Voss stepping out from behind the conveyor belt, jaw clenched, eyes locked on Caleb like he was more than just a slow traveler. The way Darren moved set off alarms in Ethan's gut. Not loud, not blaring, but quiet ones. Subtle. The kind of gut checks he'd learned to trust in foreign territory. Darren wasn't just annoyed. There was something beneath the surface. Resentment, maybe. Pride stung by someone else's presence. Ethan had seen it before. Men who mistook calmness for arrogance and authority for challenge. "I said move it," Darren snapped again, stepping closer, voice louder now. His hand hovered just over the belt line of his uniform near his badge, as if its presence alone was enough to validate his hostility. His eyes, however, weren't on the baby. They were on Ethan. Ethan didn't rise to it. Not yet. He simply stepped between them slightly, his voice measured and low. "He's just trying to calm the baby down," he said, nodding toward Caleb without breaking eye contact. For a second, the air held still. Darren didn't reply. He simply stared back at Ethan with a smirk that barely curled the corner of his mouth. The smirk wasn't for Caleb, or the baby, it was for him. Ethan had seen that kind of expression before, in men who underestimated others and then punished them for not playing small. The message was clear. You don't get to tell me anything. Behind them, the line began to shift uneasily. Passengers shifted their weight, pulling their trays closer, sensing the tension but unsure of its cause. Noah cried louder, sensing his father's nerves and the strange air around him. Caleb bounced gently again, whispering with increasing urgency. "It's okay, Noah. We're almost through." Just a little more, Darren folded his arms, and Ethan noticed how stiff his shoulders were, like a coiled spring, ready to lash out. But he didn't. Not yet. He leaned just slightly toward Ethan, his voice barely more than a whisper, but enough to make his contempt drip with purpose. "Rules apply to everyone," he said, eyes narrowing. "Even you." Ethan didn't flinch. "We're following them." "You're slowing the line," Darren said, but it wasn't about efficiency. It was a performance now, staged in front of the waiting crowd. His voice was no longer aimed at the family, it was aimed at everyone listening, everyone watching. He wanted control. He wanted obedience. And he didn't like that Ethan's presence carried its own weight. Ethan placed a hand on the tray, nudging it forward toward the scanner with precise calm. "Everything's in order." But Darren didn't step back. Instead, as Caleb bent to unclip Noah from the carrier and hold him in his arms, Darren kicked one of the small empty trays forward, letting it skid across the floor with a metallic clang. The sound echoed louder than it should have, drawing more attention. It jolted Caleb. It jolted the baby, and suddenly Noah's cries turned into screams. Ethan's body tensed. He didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't raise his voice, but every fiber of his training pulled taut. Caleb scooped Noah into his arms, clutching the child tight, trying to hush him again. But Darren was already advancing a half step. His foot moved forward again, boot scuffing against the edge of the mat. It was a careless motion, or so it seemed, except that Ethan caught where the man's boot was heading, dangerously close to where the baby's tiny hand had just dropped, palm spread out on the rubber floor mat. Ethan's voice sliced through the air, flat and sharp like a knife unsheathed. "Watch your step!" It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, but it stopped the air from moving. Darren's smirk twitched like he'd been waiting for that, like he'd been trying to provoke it. And Ethan knew, in that instant, that this wasn't about a crying baby or airport efficiency. This was about power, the kind that hid behind a badge, behind a uniform, behind bureaucracy, the kind that tested boundaries just to see who would flinch. Ethan didn't flinch. He met Darren's eyes fully now, unblinking. All those years in the Marines had taught him when a man was bluffing and when he wasn't. Darren wasn't bluffing. He was pushing, seeing how far he could take it before someone made him stop. A cold certainty settled into Ethan's chest. He didn't know exactly what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. This was just the beginning. He didn't know yet, but that look was a warning of what was about to unfold. Noah's cries pierced the air like sirens, sharp and insistent, bouncing off the sterile tiles of the terminal. The baby's wails rippled through the security line, causing heads to turn and passengers to shift uncomfortably as if noise alone could delay their flights. Caleb knelt beside the carrier, panic rising in his chest. His hands trembled as he unbuckled a strap and tried to comfort his son, whispering softly, "It's okay, buddy. We're almost through. Just hang on. Please." His voice was low, desperate, filled with the helpless tone of a young father overwhelmed in a place that offered no space for emotion. Darren Voss, the TSA officer on duty, watched with a tightening jaw. His stance was rigid, his boots planted wide, hands clenched behind his back like a drill sergeant surveying recruits. His eyes flicked from Caleb to the child, and then to Ethan Cole, standing just behind the stanchions, alert and calm. Something about Ethan's posture, straight-backed, arms loose but ready, irked him. There was no fear, no nervous glance. It was a quiet confidence Darren didn't like. "You're holding up the line," Darren barked suddenly, stepping forward. His voice sliced through the low murmur of the terminal, drawing attention like a dropped tray in a quiet room. Caleb looked up, startled. "He's just upset." "I'm trying to calm him down." Darren's eyes narrowed. "Rules apply to everyone." "Keep moving." Ethan stepped in then, calm but firm. "He just needs a moment." The baby's scared, loud sounds, bright lights. "It'll only take a second." Darren turned his glare to Ethan, sizing him up. "Sir, do not interfere with security protocol." Ethan didn't flinch. "I'm not interfering. I'm explaining. We're complying." The exchange might have ended there, but Darren's pride was now in play. He looked around and noticed a few travelers watching. Some had pulled out phones, subtly or not. The attention fueled him. He took another step, closing the space between himself and the kneeling father. Then, without warning, he swung his boot into a nearby plastic tray, sending it clattering loudly against the metal side of the scanner. The sudden noise startled Noah, who shrieked louder, his tiny face reddening with fear. "Keep it moving," Darren snapped, voice rising. Caleb flinched, arms tightening protectively around his son. He bent forward instinctively to lift the baby out of the carrier, whispering again, "Shh, I've got you. It's okay." The motion was natural, urgent, the movement of a father shielding his child. But to Darren, it was defiance, a challenge. He stepped again, this time his boot landing inches from the edge of the carrier mat, where Noah's small hand, open and twitching, brushed the textured floor. Ethan saw it instantly. He stepped forward, not rushing, not shouting, just a single deliberate pace that brought him into Darren's peripheral vision. His voice was low, deep, like a rumble before thunder. "Watch your step." Darren turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to let Ethan see the smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. It was the kind of smile meant to provoke, to dare, to poke at the edges of restraint. His eyes never left the infant's trembling fingers on the mat. The terminal seemed to tighten around them. The hum of machines faded under the tension. Even the passengers behind them sensed it, the sharp tilt of danger that crackled in the air like static. Some took a step back. Others froze entirely. Ethan's mind raced, not in panic, but in assessment. He'd seen eyes like Darren's before, in war zones, in back alleys where power was a badge and violence came dressed as order. Men like Darren didn't always lash out suddenly. They tested limits first, pushed quietly, then shoved hard when no one stopped them. Darren flexed his right hand. A subtle movement, but Ethan caught it. His fingers had curled slightly, thumb hooked inward, like someone bracing for impact or looking for control. Caleb still knelt, unaware, fully focused on Noah, whose sobs had turned into those sharp gasps babies make when they can't catch their breath. That sound rattled something deep in Ethan's chest. He shifted his stance. His instincts said the moment wasn't over, it was escalating. And Darren, standing too close, too tense, wasn't backing down. He was testing the perimeter of his power, towing the line between policy and something far more dangerous. One more inch, Ethan thought. One more step, one more twitch, and this place becomes a battlefield. Darren's gaze dropped for half a second to the hand on the mat. His boot hovered, not by accident, not by chance. Ethan's jaw tightened. His voice dropped again, steel laced into gravel. "I said, watch your step." Darren's smirk said it all. He wasn't watching anything except how far he could push. The line between authority and cruelty was about to vanish. The heel came down. A thick, sickening crack split the air like a gunshot. The weight of Darren Voss's boot crushed down on the infant's tiny hand with merciless force. Noah's scream, high and pure, ripped through the terminal with the clarity of sirens. Caleb's own cry followed, raw, helpless as he lunged forward, grasping for his child's bloodied fingers now pinned beneath a thick, black sole. Time fractured. For Ethan Cole, the world spun into silent, focused chaos. The lights overhead no longer flickered. They pulsed like a metronome counting down the seconds. He didn't feel the crowd shift or hear the collective gasp rising around him. All he saw was red, bright, blooming red spreading from beneath the security officer's boot and into the fibers of the gray rubber mat. He moved. In one powerful motion, Ethan tore through the stanchion divider, shoving it aside like paper. His hand grabbed the collar of Darren's uniform and yanked him backward with the force of a whip crack. The officer stumbled, off balance, eyes wide with shock and sudden fear as the Marine's voice exploded into the space between them. "What did you do?" Darren tried to speak, tried to point toward Caleb as if to blame him. He attacked. But Ethan wasn't listening. His knees hit the ground beside the child before Darren could even finish the lie. Caleb had already dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he cradled Noah's wrist. The baby screamed, his face streaked with tears, lips quivering with pain so overwhelming that it pierced the air like a blade. Ethan reached out, gently cupping the child's wounded hand, now swelling, red, and bent at unnatural angles. Bone protruded beneath skin in places. There was too much blood. Caleb looked up, face streaked with tears and panic. His fingers, they're Ethan. He crushed them. He crushed— "I know," Ethan said, voice low, calm, deadly. Darren took a step back, eyes darting around, realizing that everyone, was staring now. Phones had been raised. A woman in a gray blazer was already filming, her hand shaking but steady enough to record. A young man near the TSA table stood frozen, his backpack half-zipped, mouth slightly open. Another guard stood further down the checkpoint, frozen in indecision, one hand on his radio, the other gripping a metal pole, unsure whether to help or run. Ethan stood. Darren barely had time to raise his arms before Ethan's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sideways with practiced ease. The movement was sharp and smooth, just enough pressure to cause pain without dislocation. Darren winced, trying to yank free, but Ethan used his other hand to grab the back of his belt and pivoted him toward the conveyor belt. "You crushed an infant's hand," Ethan growled, his breath hot against Darren's ear. "And you think I'm just going to let you walk away from that?" The answer came with force. Ethan slammed Darren forward, sending the officer's chest into the edge of the conveyor. The impact stole Darren's breath. His legs kicked out behind him as the belt carried his chest forward toward the scanner. The machine whirred quietly beneath the weight, its hum suddenly sinister beneath the sound of Darren's panicked gasps. "Help! He's attacking!" Darren choked out, voice cracking as he flailed. But no one moved. No one believed him now. The room had turned. Not against the Marine, but against the man who wore a badge like armor and used it like a club. Ethan leaned close, tightening his grip. "You used your boot on a baby," he whispered. "I'm using the belt on a bully." The motion was brief but brutal. Ethan pushed Darren forward just enough for his cheek to scrape along the edge of the moving belt. Darren shrieked, the side of his face grinding against the rubber as the machine fed him slowly forward. It wasn't enough to cause permanent injury, but it was enough to mark him. Red lines formed against his skin, followed by panicked sobs. Behind them, another officer arrived, stocky with a silver badge and thinning hair. He shouted, "Stand down! Stand down now." But even he hesitated to move forward as he took in the sight. Passengers were yelling, "He hurt that baby! That Marine saved that child! I got it on video!" Voices overlapped in a storm of rage and justice. Ethan let go. Darren collapsed to the floor beside the belt, cradling his face and screaming incoherent words. Blood trickled down his jawline. His boot lay abandoned a few feet away, streaked with red. Caleb clutched Noah tightly, sobbing quietly now, rocking back and forth as paramedics rushed through the chaos, alerted by someone upstream in the terminal. Ethan stood over them, breathing heavily, chest heaving from both fury and restraint. Another officer approached him cautiously. "Sir, I need you to—" Ethan raised a hand. "Not now." The officer froze, unsure how to proceed, intimidated by the presence of a man who clearly wasn't done. Ethan dropped to one knee again, placing a steady hand on Caleb's back. "We've got him," he said softly. "They're coming for Noah. Just hold on." The paramedics arrived seconds later, kneeling beside the family and quickly assessing the baby's injuries. One of them, a tall medic named Brent, looked up at Ethan with quiet understanding. "This wasn't an accident, was it?" Brent asked. Ethan shook his head. "Not even close." In the corner of the checkpoint, Darren was being pulled to his feet by two junior guards, his head down, humiliated and dazed. As he turned, Ethan met his gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, no remorse, only a promise. The camera flashes started as uniformed airport police arrived and began ordering people to back away. But the damage was already done. Not to Ethan, not to Caleb, but to the lie Darren thought he could hide behind. Ethan's hands were still stained with Noah's blood, but his eyes were clear now, focused. The Marine inside him was no longer restrained. It was awake. The sound of Noah's scream cracked through the air like a siren. Time snapped. Ethan's boots were already pounding against the tiled floor as he lunged forward. Two officers nearby, startled by the rising commotion, rushed in from the perimeter to intercept him. But they weren't fast enough. The moment Darren's boot came down on that baby's hand, Ethan Cole stopped being a calm, measured Marine and became something else entirely. He met the first officer's grasp with a swift sidestep, redirecting the arm with a twist that left the man off balance. The second came from the right, aiming to grab his shoulder, but Ethan dipped low and spun, using the man's momentum to hurl him sideways into a metal luggage cart. The sound of bodies hitting steel reverberated through the checkpoint, triggering shouts from travelers and wide-eyed gasps that filled the terminal like a rolling wave. Darren didn't even have time to react. Ethan was on him. He grabbed the security officer's wrist with one hand, calloused, precise, and twisted it sharply until Darren yelped, knees buckling beneath the pressure. Then, in one fluid motion, Ethan slammed him backward into the conveyor belt. The machine whirred steadily beneath him, unaware of the violence now staining its path. Darren's back hit the metal edge with a hollow thud, and his cry echoed between the walls of Checkpoint B. "You crushed an infant's hand," Ethan growled, his breath shaking, voice low but vibrating with fury. His eyes were locked on Darren's, no longer pleading, no longer calm. His face was flushed with rage, not reckless, but righteous. It was the fury of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and finally snapped when innocence was shattered. Darren struggled to get his footing, but Ethan had locked his arm at the elbow, pressing him down with surgical strength. The belt beneath them kept moving, trays sliding by, untouched by the chaos. Passengers were now backing away from the area, their voices hushed, their phones lifted in trembling hands, catching every second on video. Somewhere, a man's voice shouted, "Get a supervisor!" Another voice, closer, screamed, "Stop the scanner!" But the chaos swirled around Ethan like wind past a storm wall. He only saw Darren. Caleb was on the floor behind them, cradling Noah in his arms. Blood smeared across his sleeve as he tried to quiet the baby's cries, his own voice cracking with panic. "Help us! Somebody help!" The tremble in his words was unbearable, his grip tight around his son, as if he could will the pain away by sheer desperation. Darren, gasping now, tried to swing his free arm at Ethan's head, but that was a mistake. Ethan parried it midair, caught the wrist with his opposite hand, and shifted his stance. With a swift pull, he forced Darren forward, turned his body, and drove the man's face down, hard, into the moving conveyor belt. The plastic trays clattered around him as Darren screamed, the grinding surface dragging against his cheek. A heavy crunch followed. The belt's slow, mechanical hum continued, indifferent to the violence it now bore. "Get him off! Get him off the belt!" one of the other guards yelled, now staggering to his feet. But no one moved. No one dared interrupt what had become an unstoppable moment. The other officer hesitated, eyes wide as he looked from Darren's mangled face to Ethan's rigid form. It was no longer a scuffle. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be undone. Darren writhed, trying to push himself up, but the Marine's grip was like iron. Ethan's boots remained planted, his arms unshaking. Years of combat, of battlefield calm, pulsed through him. Every move was precise, every action deliberate. This was not a rage-fueled brawl. This was a reckoning, methodical and final. The screech of a walkie-talkie burst into the air as a senior guard arrived on the scene. Officer Raymond Hart, tall and broad-shouldered, pushed through the crowd, barking orders. "Stand down. Both of you. I said stand down." His voice cut through the terminal, but Ethan didn't release his grip. Raymond's eyes widened as he took in the scene. A baby crying, a father covered in blood, a crowd of witnesses, and one of his own officers face first against airport machinery. He looked at Ethan, and something in the veteran's posture made him hesitate. This wasn't a man attacking recklessly. This was a man responding to something unforgivable. Passengers clustered around the edges, filming everything. A teenager near the barrier whispered, "He saved that baby," while another man muttered, "That guard, he stepped on the kid's hand." Words rippled like sparks on dry leaves, igniting the story in real time. Raymond took a careful step forward, his voice softening. "Sir, you need to let go." Ethan's chest heaved. Sweat clung to his brow. For a moment, he stared at Darren, whose face was now smeared with conveyor grease and blood. Then, slowly, Ethan's grip loosened. He stepped back, fists still clenched, chest still rising and falling like the aftermath of a battlefield charge. His eyes scanned the terminal, not for escape, but for confirmation. That someone had seen, that someone had understood. Raymond knelt beside Darren and called for paramedics over his radio. But no one was looking at him anymore. Every camera lens, every wide eye, every whispering voice was locked onto the man in the black jacket standing like a sentinel beside the belt. And somewhere, in the silence that followed the screams, the thought rang clear in Ethan's mind. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. They would try to spin this, to twist it. But the truth had been seen and recorded by dozens of witnesses. Behind him, Caleb's voice cracked again, low and trembling as he rocked his injured son. Ethan turned, and for a moment, the fire in his heart gave way to grief. He knelt beside them, touched the baby's uninjured shoulder gently. "I'm here," he whispered. "You're safe now." But even as he said it, he knew safety was temporary. The real war was about to begin, one fought not with fists, but with truth. A medic's voice rang out calling for space. The crowd began to part. Behind them, Darren whimpered, trying to sit up. His hand shook as he reached for his bruised face, and the first traces of fear, not arrogance, finally entered his expression. And in that moment, with the terminal still pulsing from chaos, Ethan rose slowly, eyes cold as steel. Justice had arrived in the form of fury. Blood spattered across the white tiles like paint flung in chaos. Ethan stood frozen for a fraction of a second, staring at Darren Voss slumped near the conveyor belt, his cheek raw and scraped from the motorized rollers. The thud of boots on polished floors echoed, followed by a cascade of shouts, alarms, and panicked murmurs from passengers scattered across the terminal. Supervisors in dark blue jackets stormed in, arms raised, shouting over the commotion, "Step back! Step back now!" But Ethan didn't move at first. His breathing was ragged, chest heaving from adrenaline and rage. The heat in his limbs hadn't faded, it pulsed through him like fire. His fists were still clenched, blood on his knuckles not his own. Across the floor, Caleb was on his knees beside the paramedics who had just arrived, cradling Noah's tiny form. The baby's hand was wrapped hastily in gauze, but blood soaked through, bright red and terrifying. The child's cries had weakened, replaced with shallow, high-pitched whimpers that barely pierced the din. Each sound stabbed through Caleb's heart. He looked up at Ethan, eyes wide with desperation, pleading without words. Two security supervisors reached Ethan from behind, grabbing his arms. He didn't resist, but his gaze never left Darren. The officer had curled into himself, one hand covering his face, the other gripping the belt's metal frame like it was the only thing holding him up. His badge, now bent and twisted on his chest, caught the overhead lights and reflected it back like a broken mirror. "You think a badge makes you above mercy," Ethan growled, his voice low and cracked but clear. His stare burned through Darren like judgment incarnate. "Back up!" "Hands behind your head," one of the officers shouted, more out of fear than protocol. Ethan exhaled slowly and raised his hands, letting them guide him backward a few steps. But the moment was already slipping from the control of authority because the crowd had seen everything. A ripple of voices surged forward as bystanders pushed in. Dozens of phones had recorded the incident, and now they were raised like torches. A man in a gray coat shouted, "He saved that baby!" A teenager yelled, "We got the whole thing!" Another voice rose from near the windowed corridor. "That officer stomped on the kid. He did it on purpose." The officials hesitated. They weren't ready for this. The narrative, so often controlled with calm statements and official reports, was spinning out beyond their grip. Ethan scanned the room. He saw the fear in the staff's faces, not of him, but of the truth unraveling in real time. Somewhere beyond the barricades, the faint sound of another siren could be heard approaching, perhaps airport police, perhaps medics. The building's emergency lights began to blink red, and an automated voice repeated overhead, "Security alert in progress. Please remain calm and follow airport staff instructions." Caleb sobbed quietly, rocking slightly as the paramedics examined Noah. One of them, a young man in his 20s, leaned toward him and said, "We need to get him to the infirmary right now." Caleb nodded shakily, holding Noah's uninjured side close to his chest. His son's breathing was unsteady, but the paramedic offered a quick, reassuring glance. "He's stable, but that hand, he's going to need scans and a surgeon's eyes fast." As they lifted the baby carrier onto a stretcher, Caleb looked up at Ethan one more time. "Stay with him," Ethan said softly. "I'll handle this." His voice no longer carried fury. It carried resolve. Steel, forged in something deeper than instinct. An officer approached from the crowd, older, with silver hair and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He looked between Ethan, the broken security checkpoint, and the trail of blood still visible on the floor tiles. "I'm going to need a statement," the man said, voice quiet but pointed. "You'll get one," Ethan replied without flinching, "along with 30 witness recordings and security footage." He gestured with his chin toward the cameras mounted near the ceiling. "Everything you need is already there." The officer gave a short nod but said nothing more. Nearby, Darren groaned as another officer helped him to his feet. His shirt was torn, face swollen, and lips split. Yet even now, he tried to speak through the blood in his mouth. "He attacked me. That man attacked me. He crushed a baby's hand," someone in the crowd yelled. Another voice snapped back, "Yeah? You gonna cry about getting slammed after that?" Darren's words died in his throat. For once, he looked around and saw what Ethan had seen the moment their eyes first met. Darren wasn't in control anymore. The badge didn't shield him. It exposed him. A young father in a leather jacket stepped forward, eyes locked on Ethan. "Thank you," he said, voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't know what to do. I was scared to speak, but you weren't." Ethan gave a single nod, then looked down at his hands, one still sticky with blood, the other trembling slightly from the fading surge of combat reflex. He flexed his fingers slowly, as if confirming that the man he had been forced to become in the last 10 minutes hadn't consumed him entirely. Behind him, the paramedics were already wheeling Noah away. Caleb followed closely, not looking back, afraid he might collapse if he did. Airport police started setting up a perimeter, trying to regain control. But control didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to the truth now captured on countless phones, in the retinas of the crowd, in the judgment of those who refused to look away. Ethan turned once more toward the conveyor belt. It still moved, humming without care for what had happened. The blood was still there, a red smear trailing across the rollers. He stared at it for a long moment, chest rising and falling, the fury in his expression slowly cooling into something sharper, colder, resolve. A supervisor stepped beside him. "You're going to need a lawyer." "I know," Ethan replied quietly. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. His eyes burned with clarity. He didn't start this fight, but he would finish it with truth. The door slammed open with a metallic clatter as Ethan Cole stepped into the infirmary, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. The bright, sterile lights above cast sharp shadows across the room, reflecting off the silver instruments on the nearby tray. The scent of antiseptic was thick in the air, but underneath it lingered something darker, fear, raw and suffocating. Caleb sat hunched over beside the cot, his hands shaking, his back rising and falling in panicked rhythm. On the bed, baby Noah lay still, his tiny hand wrapped in gauze already stained a pale red. His breathing was shallow, the occasional whimper like a knife to the heart. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, the echo of Darren's boot on Noah's hand still thundering in his ears. His fists were clenched at his sides, the tension crawling up his arms like fire beneath the skin. Every instinct screamed for him to go back out there, to finish what had started, to make Darren Voss understand what it meant to hurt a child. But he didn't move. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the small form on the bed. The soldier inside him raged for justice, but the uncle, he was paralyzed with helplessness. Dr. Alan Mercer, tall, thin, and wearing a tired expression beneath his glasses, moved briskly across the room. He didn't flinch at Ethan's presence. He'd seen enough trauma to recognize a man balancing on the edge. "The hand is fractured in multiple places," he said calmly, though his eyes lingered too long on the child's tiny frame. Caleb turned his face away, but not fast enough. Ethan saw the tears fall freely as his brother buried his face in his palms. "I should have picked him up faster. I should have seen it coming," Caleb whispered, his voice broken. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs, and his guilt filled the room like fog. Ethan stepped forward slowly, his voice low but firm. "You didn't fail him." That man, Dr. Mercer continued his examination, gently adjusting the bandage with precision. "We've stabilized him for now. No nerve damage from what I can tell, but he's going to need surgery. Multiple pins. And time." Noah whimpered softly, his eyes fluttering. Ethan reached out, resting a hand on Caleb's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it anchored them both. "He's strong," Ethan said, "just like his dad." Outside, the hum of activity intensified. Through the frosted glass windows, flashing lights cast red and blue pulses across the room. The lockdown was in full effect. Officers moved quickly beyond the door, interviewing witnesses, securing evidence. Word was already spreading. Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. Again, then again. Finally, he pulled it out. Dozens of missed calls, dozens more texts. Names he hadn't seen in years, men from his old unit. Brothers in arms. "Saw the video, Captain. We're with you. What that guard did was unforgivable. Tell me where to send the lawyers." The footage had gone viral. Somewhere in the terminal, people were still watching it on loop. Darren's boot, the scream, Ethan's counterattack. But none of it mattered now. Not the media, not the politics, just Noah. A nurse stepped in with a clipboard and hesitated, glancing at Ethan's towering frame before clearing his throat. Mr. Cole? They're asking for you. Security review. Internal Affairs wants your statement before things escalate further." Ethan didn't take his eyes off Noah. "They can wait." Caleb looked up, his face pale. "Ethan, what if they try to flip this? What if they say you overreacted?" Ethan's silence was answer enough. He stepped away from the bed, walking to the window that overlooked the terminal. The same terminal where this nightmare had begun just hours ago. Travelers were still trapped behind barricades. News cameras clustered like vultures near the entrance. Every screen in sight showed the headline, "Infant injured by security officer, Marine intervenes." The weight of it all bore down on Ethan's shoulders. He was no stranger to conflict. He'd led squads through hostile territory, made life-or-death calls in the blink of an eye. But this was different. This wasn't war. This was home. And the enemy hadn't come with a rifle. He'd come with a badge. He turned back to Caleb, his voice even. "No one harms family and walks away unscathed," he said, stepping beside the bed, his fingers brushing against Noah's blanket. His eyes didn't blink. His words didn't shake. "Not while I'm still breathing." The officer ignored the cries, grinding harder until blood pooled beneath his boot. The Marine uncle watched in disbelief until training and rage took over. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. Darren Voss sat slumped in a hard plastic chair just outside the security zone, his wrists bound by steel cuffs, his lips split, and blood crusted along the edge of his jaw. The harsh lights of North Vale's main concourse flickered slightly above, casting shadows that made his bruised cheek look darker, uglier. A thin line of blood trickled down from his temple where his face had scraped the conveyor belt. And yet, despite the pain, the public humiliation, and the crowd of stunned travelers who still lingered in the distance, his posture was far from repentant. He sat back like a man wronged, his jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring with each breath. Across from him, two airport supervisors whispered to one another in hushed, nervous tones. One glanced toward the cluster of investigators arriving in suits and badges, while the other stole a quick look at Darren, uncertainty etched across his brow. "I told you," Darren snapped before either could speak. His voice was raw but defiant. The father dropped the carrier. The baby's hand was under my foot before I even realized. I didn't mean to. It was chaos. The taller supervisor, a man with thinning hair and a laminated ID badge that read Senior Ops Manager, Keith Dern, shifted uncomfortably. "We've got footage, Darren. Multiple angles, a dozen witnesses. You sure that's the story you want to stick with?" Darren's eyes narrowed. "What do you want me to say? That I crushed a kid on purpose? That's insane. I was doing my job. The father was causing a scene. The other one, his brother, he's the one who attacked me." Before Keith could respond, the air shifted. Ethan Cole stepped into view, flanked by two uniformed officers, not restrained, not cuffed, just escorted. His boots landed solidly on the concourse tile, each step deliberate, as if the very floor was a battlefield to be claimed. His shirt was wrinkled from the scuffle, a faint smear of blood still on the cuff, but his face was composed, too composed. His calm was more unnerving than rage, the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from focus. The room quieted as he approached. The lead investigator, Detective Rowan Holt, turned to greet him. Mid-40s, in a blue-gray suit that looked slightly too warm for the building's temperature, Rowan held a notepad in one hand and a voice recorder in the other. His sharp eyes flicked from Ethan to Darren and back again. Ethan didn't wait for questions. He stepped closer, his voice low but razor-edged. "You'll want to check the footage from camera 14. Rowan raised an eyebrow. "You're sure?" "Every frame," Ethan replied, his gaze never leaving Darren. "You'll see what really happened." Rowan nodded, signaling to a technician who stood nearby with a tablet. Within moments, the crowd of officers and staff formed a semicircle around the device as the playback began. The concourse noise faded into a background hum. All eyes fixed on the screen. There was the line, the security checkpoint. Caleb kneeling beside Noah. Darren's boot lifted. Then impact. Sharp, deliberate, brutal. The screen froze on the moment of contact, Noah's small fingers visible under the heel, the baby's screams still audible even through the video's tinny speakers. The room went cold. Rowan's expression hardened. His jaw worked slightly as he processed what he'd just seen. "That's not procedure," he muttered almost to himself. Keith Dern rubbed his face, suddenly looking 10 years older. A murmur ran through the group, not of confusion, but of recognition. They had just watched a man betray the very duty he was sworn to uphold. Darren's defense collapsed in the silence. "Footage doesn't lie," one of the younger officers whispered. Darren's voice cracked, panic creeping in. "He came at me first." "He was aggressive. I thought the baby was safe." "I didn't know." Rowan turned sharply. "You looked straight at the child." "You kicked the tray before it happened." This wasn't an accident. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "You're watching it." "All of it. The injury wasn't an accident. It was spite." "Arrogance." Darren's mouth opened again, but no sound came. Rowan tucked his notepad away, a grim resolve taking root. "I'll need to make a report. Full chain of command oversight. If there are prior complaints, we'll uncover them." Ethan's face didn't change, but he took a step closer to the detective, speaking so only Rowan could hear. "I've buried men for less than this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let him hide behind the badge." Rowan met his eyes. There was no misunderstanding, no bravado. Just the kind of warning only a soldier could give, a promise forged in blood and bound by duty. He nodded slowly, straightening. Then he turned to the others. Start gathering statements. I want the body cam footage. We're reopening every report tied to Officer Darren Voss. Internal Affairs needs to see this. Now behind him, Ethan didn't move. He watched Darren slump lower in his chair, the first cracks of fear breaking through the smug veneer. Justice had been awakened. But Ethan knew better than anyone. Justice was a path, not a moment. As the concourse buzzed back to life and the investigators spread out like a tactical unit, one truth settled into the room like stone. Sometimes, justice doesn't need a courtroom, it just needs courage. By evening, the story had already crossed state lines. News alerts flashed across television screens. Security officer injures infant at Northvale International. Marine intervenes. The footage, shaky but clear, played on loop. Darren's boot descending. The baby's cry. The blood, the chaos, and then Ethan Cole's explosive response. Social media ignited. Hashtags like #JusticeForNoah, #NorthvaleIncident, and #MarineAgainstAbuse began trending within hours. Outside the hospital room, journalists gathered like storm clouds, waiting for a glimpse of the man now dubbed the Marine Father by national anchors. But Ethan wasn't giving interviews. He stood near the window of the dimly lit infirmary room, arms folded across his chest, his gaze locked on the city lights beyond the runway. Behind him, Caleb sat silently beside Noah's cot, gently stroking his son's bandaged hand, whispering soft reassurances that barely concealed his trembling voice. Ethan's thoughts were a battlefield, memories of the incident replayed in bursts. The sound of Noah's scream, the sickening weight of Darren's boot, the rush of adrenaline. But now came the part he hated most, the quiet after the storm, when people in suits decided which version of the truth would survive. Across the airport, inside a secure meeting room at the Security Division headquarters, Director Simon Lorne paced furiously. His voice cut through the room like a blade. "We cannot afford a lawsuit," he snapped. "I want this neutralized by morning. Press release, official statement, whatever it takes. Spin it. Say it was a misunderstanding. Blame panic." Confusion. 3 men sat around the long metal table, nodding stiffly, taking notes. None dared to contradict him, except one. Officer Grant Miles, lean, quiet, and observant, sat at the end of the table, his expression unreadable. He had served under Lorne for years, seen how the man dodged accountability and dismissed complaints like flies on a windshield. But this was different. A baby had nearly lost his hand. And Darren Voss hadn't just stepped out of line, he had stomped on every principle the uniform was supposed to protect. "Director," Grant said carefully, his voice low but firm, "there are prior complaints on Officer Voss. Several. If those get out," Lorne spun around, eyes sharp, "they won't. Because they're buried, and they'll stay buried. You hear me?" Grant gave a short nod, but his mind was already moving. That evening, under the cover of a routine file transfer, he downloaded a folder from the internal database, a collection of documents, reports, emails, time-stamped logs, and one chilling complaint from 6 months earlier that read, "Voss displayed excessive aggression toward a child passenger. Verbal and physical intimidation witnessed by staff." Escalation advised Grant encrypted the file and sent it anonymously to an inbox he'd traced through the news coverage. Logan Price, attorney for Ethan Cole. No message, no name, just truth. At the hospital, Logan received the email while seated in a waiting room, flipping through legal documents on his tablet. He paused, brow furrowing as he opened the attachments. The deeper he read, the more his stomach turned. It wasn't a one-time incident. Darren Voss had a record, one that had been deliberately buried. Ethan was still at the window when Logan approached. "You need to see this," the lawyer said. He handed over his tablet. Ethan read in silence. His jaw tightened. His eyes darkened, not with shock, but with confirmation. "They knew," he said. "They protected him." Logan nodded. They were counting on silence. Ethan turned back to the window, the city glowing faintly like distant embers. For a moment he saw his father's face in the reflection, stern, proud, weathered by years of service and quiet wisdom. He remembered the words spoken once on a cold evening during his final deployment. "The enemy isn't always across the border. Sometimes he wears your flag." Outside, the media continued to swarm. Inside, Caleb quietly hummed to Noah, holding his son's fingers gently. Ethan clenched his fists. The war wasn't over. It had just changed fronts. He would need a new strategy. One not of force, but of facts. Not of confrontation, but exposure. He looked back at Logan. "Get me everything. Complaints, policies, cover-ups. If this system protected him, it's part of the crime." Logan nodded slowly. "We're going public?" Ethan's reply was quiet but resolute. "We're going all the way." The room fell into stillness. The television in the hallway continued to loop the headlines, but Ethan had stopped watching. He already knew the story that needed to be told. As night fell and the hum of the city softened, he remained at the window, gaze locked on the horizon. He thought of everything ahead: courtrooms, lies, resistance. But the truth had a new soldier now. He thought of Caleb, of Noah, of every parent who ever watched their child be hurt and told to stay quiet. The next battle wouldn't be fought with fists, he thought. It would be fought with truth. The knock came at precisely 8:03 a.m. Ethan opened the hotel room door to find two men in plain clothes, badges clipped to their belts, and polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The taller of the two, Agent Frank Ryland, stepped forward with a practiced nod. "Mr. Cole, we'd like a few minutes." "Just some follow-up questions for our report." Caleb stood behind Ethan, holding baby Noah, who was wrapped in fresh gauze and fast asleep against his chest. The sight of the infant's healing hand, still swollen and bruised, was enough to make Ethan's jaw tighten. "We've already answered everything," Caleb said, his voice strained. Ryland didn't flinch. "New developments." "Shouldn't take long." Ethan stepped aside reluctantly, letting them in. The hotel suite smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Sunlight cut through the curtains in harsh streaks, slicing across the beige carpet where last night's documents still lay scattered. The second agent, Officer Brill, younger, quieter, remained by the door, eyes scanning the room like it was a crime scene. They didn't waste time. "Mr. Cole," Ryland began, pulling a notepad from his coat, "we've reviewed the footage, statements, and medical reports. And while we understand your emotional state at the time, there are concerns about the degree of physical force you used against Officer Voss." Caleb's eyes widened. "You're serious?" Ryland raised a calming hand. "We're just saying that law enforcement protocol is under scrutiny and—" Ethan cut in, voice low and steady. "So, stopping a man from crushing a baby is excessive now?" Ryland paused. There it was, the first crack in the mask. His eyes flicked away for a second too long before he replied, "We're evaluating all sides." "You didn't answer the question," Ethan pressed, stepping closer. His presence alone made the agent stiffen. "Are you here to seek justice, or to rewrite what happened?" Brill glanced at Ryland, unsure. The tension in the room thickened. "We'll be in touch," Ryland said quickly, tucking the notepad back into his coat and moving to the door. "Just part of the process." Ethan didn't follow them out. He stood still, the door clicking shut behind them. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Caleb lowered himself slowly onto the edge of the bed, his hands trembling as he adjusted Noah's blanket. "They're trying to make you the villain," he said bitterly. "You saved my son, and now they want to bury you for it." "They're protecting something," Ethan said quietly, eyes still fixed on the door. "Or someone." That afternoon, Logan Price arrived with a thick folder under one arm. His expression was grim, and when he sat at the small round table in the hotel room, he didn't bother with small talk. Darren Voss had complaints on his record, Logan said, opening the file and spreading out copies. 5 over the last 3 years, all use of force allegations, all mysteriously dismissed by Director Simon Lorne. Ethan leaned forward. That's not oversight. That's protection. Exactly, Logan nodded. And it gets worse. The complaints weren't just dismissed, they were never even formally investigated. Internal Affairs waved them off before they reached the review board. Caleb looked between them. So Lorne's been shielding him. More than shielding, Logan said. He's been erasing him. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The weight of the injustice, its scale, its deliberateness, landed hard. This wasn't about one man anymore. It was about the structure that empowered him. We don't just expose the man, Ethan said slowly. We expose the system that made him possible. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden streaks across the city skyline. The hotel room was quiet except for the hum of traffic outside and the occasional chirp of Noah's baby monitor. But Ethan's mind was loud, racing with tactics, angles, and the lessons of war that now had a new battlefield. Hours later, under the dim lights of a concrete parking garage beneath a shuttered municipal building, Ethan stood with his back against a pillar, coat collar up, face shadowed. A car rolled in slowly. The engine cut. Officer Grant Miles stepped out, a satchel slung over his shoulder. Miles approached cautiously. "You sure about this?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Every system has rot. You just have to find the leak." Miles handed over the satchel. Inside were internal emails, transfer records, and a confidential memo detailing directives from Lorne instructing supervisors to handle officer complaints internally without escalation. "This will burn everything," Miles warned. "Then it needs to burn," Ethan replied. As they parted ways, Ethan looked up toward the open night sky above the garage's top levels. A plane passed overhead, its blinking lights tracing a path into the unknown. The war he'd left behind had taught him that battles didn't end when the guns fell silent. They ended when silence was no longer allowed to grow. He walked back toward the stairwell, his steps firm, his mind sharper than ever. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, headlines, and questions he'd be forced to answer under oath. But tonight, he held the truth in his hands. He wasn't just defending a baby anymore. He was dismantling an empire of silence. The courtroom buzzed with electricity, cameras flashing like lightning against the polished wooden walls as the judge entered. Murmurs filled the gallery, reporters clutching notepads, lawyers shifting in their seats, and spectators leaning forward as if gravity itself demanded they not miss a single word. The case, Cole versus. North Vale Security Division was no longer just a local incident. It had become a national reckoning. Darren Voss sat rigid at the defendant's table, his once arrogant smirk replaced by a pale, clenched jaw. The man who had once strutted through North Vale's security lines with unchecked power now looked like a shadow of himself. His suit was too crisp, as if trying to compensate for the chaos behind the headlines. Beside him, his defense attorney whispered something in his ear, but Darren didn't respond. His eyes kept darting across the room, toward the cameras, the spectators, the judge, and finally landed on Ethan Cole. Ethan sat silently, hands clasped before him, his expression unreadable. But beneath the calm exterior, his mind was steady as steel. This wasn't about personal revenge anymore. It was about truth. It was about Noah. It was about every person who had ever been told to sit down, shut up, or move along by someone who mistook authority for superiority. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice firm. Judge Harold Keene, a tall, silver-haired man known for his meticulous rulings, nodded slowly as he scanned the room. His gaze settled briefly on Darren, then Ethan. The trial had stretched on for days, each moment tugging at the nation's attention. But now, the prosecution was ready for their final blow. The lead prosecutor stood, his tone cool and precise. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. Surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and now, this." He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him flickered to life. The footage played. Gasps echoed through the room. There it was. Darren Voss, towering over a crying infant. The boot, the stomp, the blood, the frozen expressions of witnesses, the sudden blur of Ethan leaping into frame, a blur of motion and fury. The gallery watched in stunned silence. Even Darren turned his face slightly, unable to look. When the video ended, the prosecutor took a breath. "But beyond the physical evidence," he continued, "we have something more revealing: intent." He held up a printout, bold text visible from rows away. "These are text messages recovered from Mr. Voss's phone, sent just days before the incident. Messages bragging about shutting down whiners and showing loudmouths what real power looks like." A collective murmur surged through the courtroom. One juror stiffened. Another shook his head slowly. Darren's attorney sprang up. "Objection. Those messages are taken out of context, sustained in tone," the judge said, "but proceed with caution." The prosecutor nodded and resumed. "Context or not, the message is clear. This was not an accident. This was a pattern of behavior." On the defense bench, Director Simon Lorne shifted uncomfortably. The camera turned briefly toward him as murmurs in the crowd turned to whispers. He had been called to testify earlier, denying any knowledge of misconduct. But the prosecution had cornered him with internal memos, complaints mysteriously buried, investigations that vanished before they began. It was Ethan's gaze that cut the deepest. When the judge called the next witness, Caleb stood slowly. His shoulders were tense, his voice shaking at first, but he steadied himself for Noah. "I remember my son's cry," he began. "I remember the sound of the boot. And I remember thinking, this can't be happening. Not here. Not to him." The courtroom was silent as Caleb continued, his words painting a picture of pain no parent should endure, of hospital lights and blood-stained onesies, of the helplessness he felt as his child cried and he could do nothing but hold his broken hand. When he sat down, wiping away tears, the courtroom didn't move for a moment. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Ethan Cole." Ethan stood. His steps were slow, measured. He reached the witness stand and placed his right hand on the Bible, swore in, then faced the courtroom. "I've seen war," he said. "I've seen what cruelty looks like when it hides behind rules. But what I saw that day was different." He paused, eyes scanning the gallery. Some people leaned forward. Others looked down, ashamed, as if they'd been complicit in silence. "I didn't act out of rage," Ethan said. "I acted because no one else was moving. I acted because a man in uniform decided a crying baby was an inconvenience. I acted because someone had to." He turned slightly toward Darren. "Authority without empathy is tyranny," he said, voice steady. "It doesn't protect, it destroys." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Cole, in your words, what do you believe your actions meant that day?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "That day at the airport," he said, "I didn't act out of rage. I acted because someone had to stand between cruelty and innocence." He glanced once more toward the jury, then toward Caleb and Noah. "And I'd do it again, no matter the cost." The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final. The courtroom, packed wall to wall with press, activists, uniformed officers, and silent citizens, fell into breathless silence. No whispers, no movement, just the slow rustle of robes as Judge Harold Beck adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paper in his hand. His voice carried with the weight of consequence. "After careful review of all submitted evidence, testimony, and exhibits, the court finds the defendant, Darren Voss, guilty on all counts, including aggravated assault and misconduct under color of authority." A ripple surged through the room like the shockwave after an explosion. Some gasped, others exhaled in collective relief. One woman in the gallery sobbed softly into her sleeve, but in the front row, Caleb's hands tightened around the armrest before instinctively reaching for his brother. He gripped Ethan's arm like it was a lifeline. His voice cracked through a whisper. "You did it." Ethan didn't smile. He didn't even blink. His jaw remained clenched, his eyes locked on the judge, unflinching and unreadable. Slowly, he turned his head to Caleb and shook it gently. "We did it," he said, the words quiet but filled with the weight of everything they had endured. Then his gaze drifted downward to Noah, seated in Caleb's lap, his small hand still bandaged, now gently clutching his father's thumb. The sight of that fragile grip broke through Ethan's hardened composure like sunlight through a stormed sky. Across the courtroom, Darren Voss sat in stunned silence, slouched at the defense table. The red blotch on his cheek from the conveyor incident had faded into yellowed bruises. His eyes were glazed, lips parted slightly. His attorney leaned in, whispering something urgent, but Darren didn't hear it. His posture had shifted from defiance to collapse. The man who once barked orders behind a badge now looked like someone who couldn't remember how to stand. The judge continued, voice steady but unyielding. "This court also refers Director Simon Lorne to the Office of Public Accountability for investigation regarding administrative negligence, suppression of misconduct reports, and failure to enforce duty of care standards. Effective immediately, Director Lorne is to be placed on unpaid leave pending further inquiry." In the row behind the prosecution table, Logan Price allowed himself the faintest nod. He didn't celebrate. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It was justice paid late, and justice paid late was always bitter. He leaned forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and whispered, "This sends a message." Ethan's nod was barely perceptible. Outside the courthouse, dozens of reporters waited behind barricades, cameras ready, microphones extended like spears through the crowd. The sound of the verdict had already begun to spread, through text notifications, online headlines, and live broadcasts. Chyrons blazed across news networks, Marine Wynn's case against abusive airport guard, justice at North Vale, Darren Voss convicted, security director under fire for cover-ups. Security officers moved into position to escort Voss out. He didn't resist. He stood slowly, like a man underwater, barely processing the reality around him. As he passed Ethan, their eyes met. There was no triumph in Ethan's stare, only truth, unforgiving and clear. Darren looked away first. Caleb rose with Noah in his arms, blinking back fresh tears. He turned to his brother, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought they'd find some way to twist it. I thought we'd lose." Ethan gave a small shake of his head. "Not this time." He looked around the room, at the jury box now empty, at the prosecutor packing up files, at the row of strangers who had clapped softly when the verdict was read. The battle had been brutal, but the truth had endured. As they exited the courtroom, the doors swung open, and the late afternoon sun poured in, hot and gold against the cool marble floors. The noise outside rose immediately, reporters shouting questions, camera shutters clicking, people cheering. The three of them, Ethan, Caleb, and baby Noah, stood briefly on the courthouse steps, unsure whether to pause or keep walking. The moment found them instead. Dozens of microphones were shoved forward. "Ethan, what do you have to say to the public? What would you tell other families dealing with abuse of power? Do you consider yourself a hero? Will you sue for damages? Will you file civil claims against the airport board?" Ethan raised one hand, asking for silence. The crowd hushed. He didn't read from notes. He didn't need a podium. His voice was steady, strong, not loud, but impossible to ignore. No one wearing a badge should ever crush what they're sworn to protect. That was all. No more. He turned and began to walk down the steps, Caleb beside him, Noah resting against his shoulder. Applause rose behind them, some clapping slow and steady, others cheering aloud. But Ethan didn't wave. He didn't smile for the cameras. He didn't even look back. He had not fought for fame. He had fought for fairness. And sometimes the two arrive hand in hand. The smell of antiseptic hit Ethan the moment he stepped into the hospital's pediatric therapy wing. The polished white floors reflected the overhead lights like a silent mirror to the battles fought in that building. His boots made soft thuds on the linoleum as he walked slowly down the hallway, past open doors and quiet rooms, each one filled with its own story of recovery. He had been here many times before, but today felt different. Today marked the final session, the last step in Noah's long healing process. Inside the therapy room, Caleb sat on a small plastic chair beside a padded examination table, his posture slightly hunched, his hands nervously twisting a crumpled tissue. Across from him, Dr. Alan Mercer, the same pediatric specialist who had treated Noah from the start, adjusted a set of resistance bands and soft grip tools. Noah sat on the table, legs kicking gently, a wide-eyed smile on his face as he squeezed a green foam ball with deliberate effort. The little boy's hand, once crushed under a boot, now showed movement, slow, limited, but determined. Ethan paused at the door, watching them in silence. He could hear Caleb's low encouragements. "That's it, buddy. Just like that. Nice and strong." The words were steady, but his voice cracked at the edges. Ethan stepped in, his tall figure casting a shadow across the floor as Noah looked up and instantly lit up. "Uncle Ethan," Noah chirped, still struggling with the TH sound. Ethan smiled faintly and walked over. "Hey, warrior," he said, crouching beside the table. Noah held up his tiny bandaged hand like a trophy. "See? No more ouch." Ethan reached out and let the boy wrap his fingers around one of his own. The grip was soft, but steady, and stronger than he remembered. The contact pulled something deep inside him. Not pain, not regret, something harder to define. A strange, quiet peace. "You're tougher than I ever was," Ethan murmured. Noah giggled, kicking his feet again. Dr. Mercer stepped back, removing his gloves. "His recovery exceeded expectations," he said, glancing at Caleb and then at Ethan. "We'll do a follow-up in a few weeks, but for today, this chapter closes." Caleb stood up slowly. His eyes were rimmed red, but his shoulders, for the first time in months, seemed lighter. "I can't thank you enough," he told the doctor, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got a strong kid," Mercer replied simply, patting his clipboard and turning away. As the door closed behind him, silence filled the room. Ethan looked at his brother. "How are you holding up?" Caleb gave a dry chuckle. "Better now. Every night I kept replaying that moment, wondering if I could have done more." "You did what any father would have done," Ethan said, his voice firm. "And you never stopped fighting." Caleb nodded, swallowing hard. Later that evening, Ethan found himself standing before a crowd of veterans in a church-turned town hall in Redfield, his hometown. The forum had invited him months ago, but he hadn't responded until last week. He didn't want to be seen. He didn't want to be applauded. But something had shifted. The room was filled with quiet strength, men who had faced wars both overseas and at home. Ethan took the podium with a deep breath, his gaze scanning the faces. No cameras, no reporters, just men who understood weight. "I was trained to follow orders," he began, "to protect, to survive. But no amount of training prepares you for watching someone harm your family and knowing it was preventable." He spoke for 20 minutes, about justice, about restraint, about the dangerous line between authority and cruelty. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. The truth carried weight on its own. When the speech ended, the room stayed silent for a few seconds longer than expected. Then a slow ripple of applause filled the air, not loud, but meaningful. Ethan nodded once, then stepped down and quietly left through the side door. Outside, the air was crisp. Autumn leaves crunched beneath his boots. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He needed no attention, no headlines, just a moment to breathe. Back in the city, Caleb's civil case had moved forward. Northvale's private security contractor, Stratex Solutions, had reached a settlement, not just in money, but in policy change. Under the pressure of public outrage and legal fire, they had agreed to major reforms. All airport officers were now required to wear active body cams, undergo quarterly empathy and de-escalation training, and pass annual psychological evaluations. No officer could operate without clear certification. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was something. A shift. A signal. Grant Miles, the man who had risked his career to leak the internal memo, had been appointed head of internal oversight. His first act was to reopen every complaint dismissed under Director Lorne's tenure. Darren, meanwhile, remained in a state correctional facility, stripped of his title, awaiting further civil suits from other victims who had come forward. That night, Ethan returned to the hospital for one final visit. Noah's therapy was complete, but the boy had asked for him. In the quiet of the hospital room, Noah sat on the windowsill bundled in a small hoodie, his bandaged hand now only partially wrapped. The city lights glimmered outside the glass like distant stars. Ethan sat beside him, offering a finger. Noah reached out and gripped it again, his small fingers curling with surprising firmness. "You're tougher than I ever was," Ethan murmured. In that small gesture, the Marine found peace. Sometimes healing isn't in silence, it's in the sound of someone holding on. The plaque had gone up quietly, with no ceremony, no ribbon cutting, no speeches. Just a maintenance worker in a gray jumpsuit bolting it into the wall beside Security Gate C at Northvale International. Travelers passed by, dragging suitcases, glancing at it like any other sign. Most didn't stop to read it. But Ethan Cole did. He stood motionless, his back straight, shoulders relaxed but watchful, just like he had been that day. His eyes scanned the polished metal plate, now catching the reflection of early morning light. Integrity protects innocence. 4 words etched in steel. Beneath them, a name. In memory of the incident on March 18th, and in honor of all those who choose courage over silence. Ethan said nothing. His breath was even, controlled. But inside, memories moved like a tide, slow, heavy, unrelenting. The sound of Noah's scream. The way the floor had gone slick with blood. The resistance in Darren's neck as Ethan forced him into the conveyor belt. The fight had ended long ago, but the echo never quite left. A small group of TSA trainees passed by, led by a senior officer giving them a tour. The man slowed, pointing at the plaque. "This was installed after a major incident," he explained, voice low. "Changed a lot of our policies." That child. He trailed off, realizing Ethan was standing there. Their eyes met. The officer nodded, uncertain. Ethan nodded back, just once, then looked away. In the year since the incident, life had changed, but not in the ways the media predicted. Ethan had turned down every interview, every book deal, every opportunity to become a public figure. He wasn't interested in being a symbol. He only wanted to build something real. And so, the Vanguard Line was born, a nonprofit carved from quiet grit rather than fame. Its mission was clear: defend the innocent from abuses of power and ensure that cruelty under authority would never be excused again. He'd started it in a borrowed office above an old barbershop in Redfield. The furniture was second-hand. The internet cut out sometimes, but the inbox never stayed empty. Letters, footage, testimonies, some from airports, some from police departments, some from schools. All the same pattern: power without accountability. Uniforms used as shields, not symbols of service. Caleb handled the legal side. His voice had grown firmer in courtrooms, steadier in press briefings. He'd found purpose not just in Noah's healing, but in helping others fight back with words, facts, and law. And Noah had learned to walk. Ethan still remembered the first time the boy took 3 steps on his own across the therapy room floor, his bandaged hand outstretched, mouth open in triumph. That moment had felt like a medal pinned to his heart, not for heroism, but for hope. The nonprofit's logo was simple, a small, open hand beneath a steel-gray shield. Ethan hadn't come up with it. A volunteer graphic designer had submitted it anonymously. But the moment Ethan saw it, he knew. That was it. That was Noah's hand. At the airport now, he watched as a young father crouched to tie his child's shoe. The boy giggled, then pointed toward the security gate with wonder. Ethan smiled faintly, but his eyes remained sharp. He wasn't looking at the people. He was watching the system, its gears, its blind spots, its potential to fail again. Vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Grant Miles, now head of oversight for North Vale's security department. New case flagged. Might need Vanguard's help. Details coming. Ethan typed one word back. Received. He didn't allow himself celebration. Not yet. Too many cases. Too many plaques that hadn't been hung. Too many places where silence still ruled. A sudden noise drew his attention, the distant roar of a jet engine slicing through the sky beyond the glass walls of the terminal. Travelers looked up briefly, then returned to their phones. But Ethan followed the plane's path with his eyes until it disappeared behind a veil of clouds. In his chest, the familiar ache returned. Not pain, not fear, but responsibility. The kind you don't choose, but carry anyway. A janitor nearby wheeled his cart past the plaque, pausing briefly to wipe the smudge from its surface. His rag moved with slow care, then he gave the plate one final glance before continuing down the terminal. Ethan stepped closer, his reflection caught faintly in the steel. A man graying at the edges, eyes hardened not by violence, but by purpose. He didn't think of himself as a hero. Never had. Heroes were stories people told after the smoke cleared. Ethan didn't believe in smoke. He believed in consequences, in standing firm when the ground trembled, in doing what had to be done even when the cameras weren't rolling. He inhaled slowly, then whispered, not for the crowd, not for the press, but for himself. Justice isn't revenge, it's responsibility. And for the first time since that terrible day, he smiled. The fight was over, but the lesson would last forever. He thought his badge made him untouchable. Seconds later, his face was dragged across the conveyor belt. If you stand for justice, protection, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of abuse of authority, retaliation, and the consequences of cruelty and arrogance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire accountability, justice, and empathy in the face of oppression.